The 2003 and 2004 SVT Cobra Terminator. This car has so much story and heritage to tell. If you're not a Ford or a Mustang person, you're probably going to get a schizoid embolism watching this. This car has a rabid following. And the people that love this car love it so much that I'm afraid to say anything bad about it because I know I'm going to get shot. But it's time to talk about the interior space before we get into the story and the mechanical attributes. Now, before I get into the negatives of the interior space, which is essentially the entire interior, this car is one of the cleanest examples you'll ever witness. 19,000 miles. There's no creaks, there's no insane rattles in here yet. So this is at its best, which is not saying much, considering the 90s era of Ford interior design makes me feel like I'm sitting in a garbage dumpster. The plastics look like they spent maximum $5 for this entire interior space. The center console, the gaps between the upper and lower dash are so big, I could fit a stack of $100 bills that I carry around with me. The coin holder, the cup holders, everything just has this waft of cheapness. It makes the C5 Corvette interior feel like I would be sitting in a Rolls Royce, but it doesn't end there. The knobs, buttons, and switches feel horrific, like the headlight switch is gonna rip off in my hand if I pull it too hard. The vents, they're paper thin. I feel like they're gonna dry rot and just crack or turn to dust if I touch them too hard. The only redeeming part of this interior space in my perspective is the seats. They look good, they feel great for the era, until you try to adjust them. That's right, the front cushion is so high that I feel like I'm sitting on a commode. I brought my girlfriend and Barbara in here. She's like, I thought you had the Ferrari. I thought you were gonna take me out in the Ferrari. I said, no, this car has heritage. She said, what heritage is it? It feels like I'm in a porta potty. I said, babe, let's talk about it. She said, I'm gonna dump your ass for Leonard. Leonard's got a lot more money than you. He doesn't drive a piece of shit 90s Mustang. I want premium materials. I want premium design.
My name is Carl, and Mark just got erased because no one is buying an SVT Terminator for a luxury car experience. They're buying it for the motor, the trans, and the heritage. Speaking of heritage, this dash is a double bubble design, which is a throwback to the 1960s Mustang. You have these splatter paint inscriptions that read bro, both on the steering wheel and on the dash. The SVT gauge cluster is easy to read and bespoke to the Cobra. The pedal box, thank God it's a manual, is easy to heel toe if you have nice, girthy feet. The shifter, it's got a great mechanical feel. It makes your biceps bulge. And don't forget, because you're a breeder, because you're an alpha, you have children that fit in the back seats. You have a usable trunk, and you have great visibility in this cabin. Now, people always ask me, Jack, what do you feed that thing? And I say, moms. You've got a lot of nerve showing your face around here.
Look who's talking. And now that we're done joking around, you saw the interior, and yes, we're not completely serious about that. Well, maybe I am. The story behind this car is incredible for a product like this, and it makes sense why people are so passionate about it. So to respect them and the people involved in designing this, we're gonna go through some of that, Jack.
Yeah, so this car is a Terminator Cobra, which they built these cars for 2 years, 03 and 04, and this is a complete SVT product. So you want to talk about that for a little bit?
Yeah, so SVT was a division, a performance division of Ford, which is now technically Ford Performance, now in the modern era, and they were the high performance group that did certain cars. Now, in this time frame, this was truly an SVT product. They took it over, that division took it over, and they wanted to make it very serious compared to the previous model years Cobra that was naturally aspirated, far less hardcore than this.
So originally, so this is a New Edge Mustang. When the New Edge Cobras came out, those cars were developed not by SVT, but by the Mustang team.
Yes. So SVT took this over, and it was led by
John
Coletti, who is a Ford legend, and this man had a lot of energy to put into not only the Mustang brand, but to put the energy to turn this into a next level product. He could get a lot more done in an organization that was all about cutting cost, pinching pennies, mass production, which the Mustang really was. And that was one of the hardest parts about taking this car that really is ancient trying to bring it into the new era and also making it competitive with the other pony cars or muscle cars of the era.
It's safe to say that this car would not have existed without someone like him.
Their goal was, one, make it faster, and they had to add a blower. So he went to his team, he's like, how do we make this car amazing? And they're like, there's no way we can do it. Like every development story, everybody's like, you can't do it, it costs too much money, blah, blah, blah. And it took him getting pissed off. I'm like, are you with me or are you against me? Are we not gonna get this done? And they said, fine, we'll figure it out. He suggested doing an Eaton blower, a 90. And then his team came back and said, no, 90's not big enough. Let's do a 110, make it bigger, better. And that's when the push started to just turn this into a beast. And the internal discussions were, what were we going to code name it? And then they were throwing around names, and it was all centered around Arnold Schwarzenegger, which they didn't say, but they came up with Commando, and it wound up being Terminator. And then the PR joke was like, we're going to terminate the competition. You know.
Well, and if you think about it, right, the original SVTs, the new edges, were losing to the equivalent F-body Camaros. But by the time this came out, the F-bodies were dead. GM wasn't selling any of them, but John wanted to end the discussion to prove that he knew how to build a better vehicle. So, Mark, as I mentioned earlier, this is a new edge Mustang, and that platform, its roots come all the way from 1979 from the Fox body. So this is an ancient architecture, which means the SVT team had a lot of limitations.
The 70s, and they stretched this out all the way out to 2000.
Yeah, so this is by modern standards a 40-year-old architecture.
That's nuts. And so when you look at the front suspension here, the subframe, the control arms, all that, it looks like a rear suspension out of a modern car. You have a stamped steel lower control arm that is large, but it has its own spring perch. The spring is separated from the damper, which is a strut. They use Bilstein dampers here that are retuned. The spring rates are around 600 pounds, and then the convertible gets softer spring rates by about 100 pounds. But you look at the knuckle, it is this cast puny piece, and they did make some changes to the lower control arm ball joint.
Yeah, they basically lengthened it out or pushed it out by a quarter of an inch. In fact, SVT did their best with the limitations of this architecture. So for example, the steering in Mustangs of this generation is not very good. So they took a thicker T-bar in their steering rack to add a little more firmer feel. It's the same T-bar that you'd find in a Mach 1 or a Cobra R.
Let's go on to the trans. What is this here, Jack? This is a cable. Where's the hydraulic lines?
No, this is a manual clutch. That's why it is such a firm pedal feel. In fact, this is the Tremec, well now Tremec, T56, and this unit is not a 5-speed, it is a 6-speed. It has 2 overdrives. 5th and 6th are overdrive gears. It's a very stout transmission. In fact, they use it in a lot of other cars, like an Aston Martin Vanquish.
Wow. And this has a lighter weight aluminum flywheel, among other features in the middle of the car. But I think that takes care of most of the front end, Jack. Let's get to the back.
All right.
In the rear of the Terminator Cobra, from the transmission all the way to the differential, we have an aluminum drive shaft, which helps to curb weight and helps spin up that sweet engine a bit faster. It is paired to a differential with a clutch pack style limited slip. And the most interesting part of the back is this independent rear suspension. It's not something that existed in a Ford product like this before or after this car.
Yes, this is the IRS that wasn't built by Ford. It was built by a company called Benteler. And in fact, it showed up on a pallet.
And they did this because Ford did not have this designed. They did not want to design it, or nor could they for mass production because of cost. So they went to a third party that already could develop this much quicker, and it would be a cheaper solution, a better solution for this car. And there are multiple things about the Terminator Cobra that follow the same suit. They didn't have it, they had to source it out elsewhere, otherwise this car would not exist.
Yeah, and this rear IRS actually looks very similar to what you'd find on a modern S550 Mustang, which means it has divorced springs.
Something very common, a common term for Mustang owners.
Yeah. The other thing to bring up about the rear end, Mark, is the 355 gear ratio in the rear diff.
Yeah, and that's something they wound up hemming and hawing over because originally the gear ratios were different, and the problem was it's like second gear stretched out to like 96 miles an hour. So they settled on the 355 because it was the best feeling for the street. You could row through gears, you could enjoy shifting gears, and that's what they wanted.
Yeah, I think that John Coletti came up with this car. One of the design parts of this was he wanted something that was fun for the street, trackable, so this car pulled 0.9 Gs, but was also comfortable.
Let's talk about the engine because I think that the biggest story is there.
All right.
Under the hood, Jack, the Terminator Cobra engine is where a ton of money went and time. Also, what makes this what it is. The previous generation Cobra was not enough. And when they took that engine, the naturally aspirated version, they tried to stuff it in here. During their initial testing, they found out it's not going to cut it. And John went back to his team and said, this is not enough, we have to do more. And it was a huge fight. But at the end, they decided on using a supercharger, a huge Eaton unit that wasn't just going to be slapped in here without doing a lot of testing. So this engine at its core came out of the SVT Lightning. They repurposed it. However, for the SVT Lightning, since it was a truck, it had a much lower redline, it had a different transmission, it had a different bottom end, so they had to alter it here for this car.
So they went back to the 4.6 liter versus the over 5 liter that came in the Lightning. And the reason they did that is they wanted it to rev. So this has some of the internals from the prior generation engine. However, they went to an iron block. They have Manley connecting rods, and they changed the piston design to lower the compression ratio.
The Manley connecting rods are an interesting story. Ford had to outsource to them to get a forged unit because during their testing, they used the existing cast connecting rods, and the engine was only making it 10 to 20 hours under torture tests, which it should be in the hundreds of hours of testing. And this is where it became a huge discussion internally because much like the independent rear suspension, Ford was not going to invest the time,
the manufacturing
costs, and the money on a bespoke part for one engine and one car. And this is the problem with mass production and big companies. So Manley was able to supply them with these parts. However, they were $56 per connecting rod, which doesn't sound like a lot, but when you're Ford, they were only paying $4 to $5 for their cast connecting rod and the regular engine. So they had to bury this cost and strip cost out elsewhere to afford to be able to do that.
But I'm glad they managed to build a motor like this because not only is it one of the most reliable high horsepower V8s, think back to the era. This came out in 2003 and this made 390 horsepower. In reality, because these motors were hand built in Romeo, Michigan, they often made more than that. Most owners were dynoing at 390 to the wheels or thereabouts.
And one of the best parts is, and one of the most unique parts about the Terminator, and we joke around about this, of course, this car has the staying power because of all the money and time they went through to make sure that this was as bulletproof as possible. And it's a testament to it because current owners, now 20 years removed, are able to put 600, 700 wheel horsepower down completely reliable. And that says a lot to me that they put in this effort to do it. It stood the test of time. Now it's time to see what it drives like on the street, Jack.
All right. So Mark, we're in a Terminator Cobra, and before we talk about anything else, let me demonstrate something for you.
Holy shit.
Yeah, it's it sounds healthy.
Yeah, it's a put it that way. Ooh, there's a lot of float in the suspension. It's really comfortable, I'll give it that.
This is not a car you buy for interior refinement or nimble handling or any of that. Though the IRS, as you did mention, feels surprisingly decent, you buy it because of the soundtrack. And because of that, it's pretty damn addicting.
It sounds really good. It sounds really good, and there's not a lot done to this car either.
It's a weird car, Mark, because like you, I don't like the new Edge Mustang. This is probably the bottom of the barrel in the Ford Mustang portfolio.
If you're not somebody loaded full of nostalgia for this car, and we talked a little bit about this in the interior segment, that, you know, at face value, there is, if you're not from that era, you didn't grow up with these cars, there's not a huge cool factor to it. Until you get behind the wheel and feel all the work that they did. Transmission, the engine, the mechanicalness of this, from the throttle. You can feel the throttle cable binding up when you're pushing on it. You don't feel that type of stuff anymore.
This is all about mechanical connection and theater and comedy, right? This is a funny car. And even though it is this whimsical, ridiculous automobile, because the IRS, because they did everything they could with this platform, which is really from 1979, it is surprisingly decent. I thought that this thing was going to be a total shitbox.
Now, I've been in, when this car came out, I was in it as a young man, and we even joked around about it back then being really not the greatest in terms of quality. Let's talk about engine for a second. We talked about that in the shop. So walk me through the way that this delivers power.
It is basically, if you've driven, despite being dual overhead cam, if you've driven an LS motor with a blower, that's what it feels like. It's two flat lines, but surprisingly, this makes peak power around 6,000 RPM. It's super linear, and what the supercharger does is effectively makes this feel bigger than a 4.6 liter V8.
It feels very powerful for this era, and even to today's standards, this is incredibly quick. And I expected this to feel very dated. The mechanical linkage to the shifter, now granted this is a MGW unit. The way that you're able to control the power, but I think between the shifter and the engine, this car feels amazing to drive. It really does.
It's really well balanced, as I'm about to demonstrate. It's not scary. It's very predictable. If you're not going to buy this car as your only vehicle, and particularly when you're considering the price of being around, let's say $25,000 to $30,000, and you're just looking for a good time, you want theater, you want to feel something from your car that's just raw comedy, I love this thing.
I gotta say, the only other Mustang that I've been in that gave me this type of connectedness is the new GT350. And I know the GT350 is naturally aspirated, but it's like, your MT82 and your 5-liter Mustang
was junk.
It just did not feel good. This is just unbelievably, your arm is a part of the transmission, your foot is a part of the engine. The only negative parts about driving this, and it's more era specific, are the brakes are throwaway. The brakes are horrible considering how fast you can get this going.
And how heavy this car is.
How heavy it is. When you come up on a turn, you're like, oh no. And you worry about braking confidence. The steering is
totally dead.
It's totally dead. It's not the worst for this era. It's very 90s car-ish, but it's not as bad as I thought it was going to be. And let's talk about suspension. This is on a stock suspension, correct?
Yes.
All right. So there is a ton of compression. There's not a lot of rebound in these dampers, so what you get is a great ride. It's really kind of more floaty, but when you get into higher speeds, that's when it gets scary because there's a lot of lift off this car. And I think if you were going to do two things to this, which I wouldn't touch this car, it's pristine, I would have to do brakes and I would have to do suspension on this, and it would be so amazing for the time that it was designed. It still holds up today and then some.
Yeah. So with that, Mark, let's head to the final thoughts.
All right. Final thoughts on the SVT Cobra Terminator. Now, believe it or not, there are plenty of things we left off the table here. There's just too much to cover. I had to buy a book called Iron Fist Lead Foot, which documents the journey from pre-production to the final product. If you want to learn more in Dungeons and Dragons level of detail, go buy that book on Amazon. Now the pros and the cons. There's a huge reason why the Cobra is still relevant today. That's because of all the work they put into the mechanical design. They borrowed what they learned from the Cobra R, embedded it in here, and just injected it with steroids. It's an amazing driving car even to today's standards. If you took care of it, like the owner has, like John has with this car that we drove, it's just remarkable what you can do with it. Now, the negatives are the interior. It's horrible. Even for the era, it's not good. The suspension's a little soft, which is to be expected from that era. The tire compounds back then weren't what they were today, so everything's just softer overall. And then we get to the last of it, the exterior styling, which I didn't even touch because that's kind of a subjective element. But the lead designer worked on the Ford GT and this car in the same studio at the same time. So while it may look like a subtle Mustang variant, this thing was put in a wind tunnel. They thought about all those little elements that make it a complete package. And when I drove it, that's exactly what it felt like. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.